Mr. President.
The Senator for Missouri.
Mr. President, first I would just like to once again state for the record of this august body that the very first effort that was made after the vote was declared to not pass the CR was me standing at this podium and asking unanimous consent for us to pass my amendment that would pay the military and the death benefits. And that was objected to by the majority leader. I am hopeful that this will get worked out quickly. We have, in the last time we had this kind of dysfunction in the government, we did this by unanimous consent very quickly, so there was no even hint that anybody in this body was not 100% behind making sure that our military got the pay they deserve. I'm hopeful that this is done yet today. I think it would be good if we could do it yet today, but certainly no later than tomorrow. We need to take care of that because I know, I'm guessing it will be every single senator that will support it without anyone objecting. But the reason I rise today is because I had to miss a very, very important event in St. Louis this morning. There was a going home celebration for a warrior in St. Louis this morning. I have been blessed to have the opportunity to meet so many amazing people in my journey serving the public. I don't think anybody I met could in many ways stand up to Frankie Freeman. Frankie Freeman was a woman who had a very simple goal in life. Her goal was to do everything she could to eliminate discrimination. Frankie was born in November of 1916. She was one of 8 children. She was raised in a segregated neighborhood in Virginia, and she said from the time she was a very young girl that she wanted to change the world. She met her husband of over 50 years in New York, where he was attending graduate school. Why was he in New York attending graduate school? He was from Missouri. He was in New York attending graduate school because after graduating from Lincoln, a historically black college in Missouri, the University of Missouri refused to admit him and said, rather than allow you on our campus, we will pay to send you to New York for graduate school. Frankie was in New York. Her husband was in New York. They met, they fell in love, and they got married. Frankie then, they moved to the Washington, D.C. area, and Frankie then decided she was going to law school. Her third year of law school, she went to Howard Law School. Her third year of law school, she was 9 months pregnant when it was time to sign up for her third year of law school. So she went to the dean of the Howard Law School and said, could you allow me to join a few weeks late in the term? He took one look at her, 9 months pregnant, and said, you're going to have to sit out a year. She said, I don't want to sit out a year. I got to get this done. I've got work to do. I've got justice to seek. I will not sit out. So she went out and stood in line to sign up for her classes third year, literally within days of giving birth. And 4 days later, after she finished registering for her third year of law school, she gave birth. Did that slow her down? No. She went on to graduate from Howard Law School that year, number 2 in her class. Now keep in mind, she graduated from law school. An African-American woman in America graduated from law school in 1944. That's almost 10 years before I was born. Imagine what life was like for a young black woman lawyer in America in 1944. She had 2 children. Her daughter Shelby and her son, who was also named Shelby but called Butch, they moved to St. Louis with her husband and 2 children. Butch, by the way, died when he was 11. Shelby remained at her mother's side and helped her remain active until the last days of her life. So she moved to St. Louis as a young African-American woman lawyer, and you can imagine there were no law firms that wanted to hire Frankie. So Frankie opened her own law office. Her mission, to go after the institution of discrimination through the courts. And she was fearless and strong and kind and polite. One of the most famous cases that Frankie did occurred in 1952, Davis versus the St. Louis Housing Authority. Keep in mind now, in 1952, there was the written policy of the St. Louis Public Housing Authority that said that the races should not mix. It was unnatural for the races to mix. Frankie decided she would take that on. She won that case in 1952, and she went on. It was appealed and appealed, and she went on and won the appeal in front of the Supreme Court in 1954. I was 1 the year she won that appeal. One of the stories about Frankie's life that I think is important to put in context happened in 1961. You see, she was a Delta. In fact, she went on to be the president of the Deltas in 1967, a very important sorority for many, many accomplished African-American women in this country. But in 1961, the Delta chapter down in the Boot Heel in Hayti, in the Boot Heel, right on the heel, asked her to come down and give a speech. She was famous for having won this case, and she was honored to be asked to go down and give the speech. She didn't have anybody to drive with her, and she was worried about driving by herself into the Boot Heel in 1961. This is a year after President Kennedy was elected president. So she got on the Greyhound bus, and the Greyhound bus stopped at a restaurant along the way so the people on the bus could use the restroom and get a bite to eat. And Frankie walked in that restaurant in a small town between St. Louis and the Boot Heel, and she was told by the waitress that she couldn't come in the front door. Now keep in mind, she had been all the way to the United States Supreme Court, arguing ugly discrimination in public housing. And this waitress in this restaurant in this small town told her she could not come in the front door. And even worse, when Frankie ignored her and walked towards the restroom, a customer got up and blocked the door so she could not use the restroom. Frankie wrote about this in her book, A Song of Faith and Hope. And I think about the strength that this woman had by herself in that situation, and I am filled with awe and admiration. In 1964, Frankie was the first woman on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and she did so much more than all of the famous cases and trials. In the midst of her landmark trials and court cases, she became the president of the Deltas. As I said, she later went on to travel and visit many African nations, serving as U.S. representative at the United Nations Housing Conference. In 1978, President Carter appointed her Inspector General of the Community Service Administration. She continued to show her commitment to service as an active member on several boards, including the Howard University Board of Trustees, the Urban League of Metropolitan St. Louis, the board chair, and also the board chair of the National Council on Aging. In 2007, Freeman was inducted into the International Civil Rights Walk of Fame at the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site in Atlanta, Georgia, for her leadership in the civil rights movement. You know, Frankie had a nickname among people who were touched by her passion and commitment to that elusive quality known as justice. She was known as Frankie Freedom. I had an opportunity to get to know Frankie in the last decade of her life. I treasured the time I had with her, the encouragement she gave me, the stories she told me, the legend that she was. She would always say to me when I would express frustration, and Frankie said this throughout her life, she would quote Luke chapter 9, verse 62. No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. Frankie would always say, keep your hand on the plow. Keep your hand on the plow. Keep your hand on the plow. Frankie lived 101 years. Glorious years. She had personal tragedy and countless setbacks, but she never lost her attitude of love and commitment to justice. I was so sad to miss her coming home celebration this morning. She has gone home. There is no question she is reviewing legal briefs for the good Lord himself in heaven above. Thank you, Frankie Freeman, for a life well lived.